All right, everybody, let's get started. My name is Bob Pasnow. I'm the director of the Center for Western Civilization, Thought, and Policy. It's great to see so many people come out for our first formal event of the year. I've barely got a voice, but fortunately I don't need to talk for too long before I hand it over to the man next to me. So pretty confident I can get through what I need to get through. Though, if I were to go through all of his achievements, I'd be here long enough to lose my voice, for sure. The gentleman to my right is, of course, Stephen Presser. He is the Emeritus Raoul Berger Professor at Northwestern University's Law School, where he also held an appointment in the Kellogg Business School and in the Northwestern History Department. He is, of course, also, more to the point as far as we're concerned, he is jointly the 5th scholar to join us in Boulder for the year as a conservative thought and policy scholar. And this is something like an inaugural event where we invite Professor Presser to tell us a bit about his work and to meet students and community. As I said, the list of achievements is long. I'll just mention some of the books. He's written an introduction to the law of business organizations. He's written a book on law and jurisprudence in American history. He's written a book on piercing the corporate veil. He's written a book on recapturing the Constitution, race, religion, and abortion reconsidered. His most recent book is entitled Law Professors, 3 Centuries of Shaping American Law. And I can tell you that's really quite an interesting book that I'd recommend to you. He'll be very active in the community this year, as we've had the good fortune to have that be the case with all of our visiting scholars so far, and it's already abundantly clear that that pattern's going to continue this year. But probably most importantly of all, he's teaching for us. He's teaching 2 very well-enrolled classes for us. He's teaching in the history department a 2-semester history of American law, and in the business school, in the law school, he's teaching a course on corporate law. And I've heard great reports already about both of those classes. I've seen him teach before and know he's a wonderful teacher. Perhaps some of you have been hearing him teach. I've heard him lecture before. Well, you're all about to hear him lecture before as well if you never have, and I can tell you he's a wonderful lecturer as well. So, without further ado, Stephen Presser.
Thank you very much, Bob. Can you hear me? I think I'm mic'd, so good. As I always like to say when I begin a lecture like this after a wonderful introduction like that, lower your expectations. This is the first time I've given this lecture. Not only is it my inaugural lecture, but I've been working on it up until the last 2 minutes or so. And I'm trying to throw something together. I should say before I begin, though, that it's an absolute treat to be here. It's only been about 2 or 3 weeks in the classroom, but it's been wonderful. The students are terrific. They're very nice to me, and I am deeply touched to be here. I'm very grateful to Bob Pasnow, to Alex Holmgren, to my wife who's here, and to my stepdaughter Maddie, who's also here, for turning out, and to all of you. Well, let's hope there's something worthwhile to say today. I want to take the temperature of the room before I move any further. The talk is called, Is President Trump a Danger to the Republic? How many think, yes, indeed, President Trump is a danger to the Republic? How many think, no, he's not a danger to the Republic? How many aren't sure? How many don't care? Right? At least indifference is low. That's excellent. All right, we're thinking about that man, okay? Now, what I like to do, and I've become quite devoted to this, is to give you a roadmap for what it is I'm going to talk about. So here are the takeaways from today's lecture. I'm going to talk a little bit about the controversy over Brett Kavanaugh and Neil Gorsuch. Then I'm going to explore, as an explanation, what I'm calling 2 traditions, really, in American jurisprudence. I think they explain a little bit about what's going on. Then I do want to explore what I do believe are some dangers to the Republic at the current time, the current dangers to the Republic. I'll say a word or 2 about fake news, and I'll say a word or 2 about the special counsel controversy. And I'm aiming to be provocative. You don't have to agree with anything that I say. All I want to try to do is expose the issues and get you thinking and tell you some of the lines along which I've been thinking and working. I also want to give you some reasons not to despair. I don't think you need to. There are some profound checks on presidential power out there. One of them is impeachment, and I'll say a few words about that. I'm then going to shift gears just a little bit and talk about things a sensible republic ought to be doing. And that's where I'm going to try to draw on the insights of conservative thought to fit with the position that I have here. And all throughout this little lecture, I'm going to make suggestions for further reading and some predictions about what might happen in the future. We're very fortunate to have the talk recorded, and I assume at some point it'll be up on the website, so you don't need to make notes. All right, let's sail into this. The first question to ask then is that man a threat to the Republic? Is Brett Kavanaugh a threat to the Republic? There certainly are people who think so, okay? Here's one of them. That's Erwin Chemerinsky. He's the dean of Berkeley. He wrote in the LA Times last week, Kavanaugh, like Roberts before him, said justices should be umpires, just calling balls and strikes. Nonsense, says Chemerinsky. Justices are not umpires at all. Umpires apply rules and have little leeway in determining how those rules should be interpreted. The Supreme Court creates the rules, and justices have enormous discretion how to interpret the law. How a justice votes is very much a result of his or her ideology and views. No constitutional right is absolute, and constitutional cases constantly involve balancing of the government's interest against the claim of a right. A justice's own ideology and life experiences inevitably determine how he or she strikes the balance. Now, Chemerinsky's view is the view, to a great extent, of the legal academy. It's also completely wrong. If that's what justices are doing, then they aren't exactly justices, they're E4s. They're super legislators, really. But he's not the only one, Chemerinsky, saying these kind of things. Here's Paul Krugman. It's okay to hiss if you like. He's a columnist, and he's, I believe, a Nobel Prize-winning economist. He wrote an interesting piece in the New York Times. The title gives you a clue. Kavanaugh will kill the Constitution, it says. Republicans refused even to give President, I'm quoting, President Barack Obama's nominee so much as a hearing. They will, if Kavanaugh is confirmed, have filled 2 positions with nominees chosen by a president who lost the popular vote and eked out an electoral college win only with the aid from a hostile foreign power. If confirmed, said Paul Krugman, he, Kavanaugh, and his fellow justices will abuse their power at every level. Kavanaugh is far to the right, says Krugman. He is a right-wing apparatchik. Even if Democrats, this gets better, even if Democrats take control of the legislature, wrote Krugman, there's every reason to believe that a court, including Kavanaugh, would strike down everything elected officials tried to do. A vote for Kavanaugh will be a vote to destroy the legitimacy of the last honest federal institution standing, that is to say, the court. Now, you might guess I don't agree with that either, actually. And finally, in the critical to Kavanaugh column comes Kirsten Gillibrand, who said very simply that Kavanaugh is, quote, dangerous for women, and women will die if Kavanaugh is seated on the high court. Now, she, of course, is assuming that he would be the 5th vote to overrule Roe versus Wade. I don't think there's any chance of that at all. Now, why this hysteria, if we can call it that? Now, some of it is actually fair criticism, and I'll say something about that in a minute. What's really going on here? We have seen this movie before in 1987 with that man, Robert Bork. You'll remember Robert Bork's America is a land in which women would be forced into back alley abortions. Blacks would sit at segregated lunch counters. Rogue police could break down citizens' doors in midnight raids. School children could not be taught about evolution. Writers and artists would be censored at the whim of government, and the doors of the federal courts would be shut on the fingers of millions of citizens for whom the judiciary is often the only protector of the individual rights that are at the heart of our democracy. That speech is called Robert Bork's America, and you'll remember that it was given by Teddy Kennedy. What you may not know is Robert Bork wrote an interesting book, and I do commend it to you. And he talked about Kennedy's speech. He said that afterwards, he said to Kennedy, you know, every single word of that speech is not true. And Kennedy said, yeah, I know, it wasn't personal, it's just politics. Bork was not happy with that. But of course, it is a sign that politics is now unbelievably important when we're trying to think about the judiciary. And I want to go just a little bit further. There's a somewhat calmer forecast made by this man, Adam Liptak. He is the Supreme Court correspondent for the New York Times. He succeeded Linda Greenhouse, who had a very powerful influence. You've heard of the greenhouse effect, I think. And that effect is to move Republican appointees to the left in order to get the approval of Linda Greenhouse. It was a very powerful thing. Many people think Anthony Kennedy suffered from the greenhouse effect. But be that as it may, her successor, who I think is a very bright guy, he's a Yale Law School graduate, does some teaching at Yale. And he said, I'm just going to throw this out, he said, if Kavanaugh is confirmed, the center of gravity, I think he used slightly different words, is going to shift quite a bit on the Supreme Court. John Roberts will become the swing justice. And as a result, we can expect, he said, further restrictions on access to abortion. We can expect the Supreme Court to limit the use of race-conscious decisions in areas like college admissions. We can expect the Supreme Court to uphold voting restrictions imposed by the states. We can expect the Supreme Court to expand gun rights. We can expect the Supreme Court to strike down campaign finance regulations. And we can expect the Supreme Court to give religion a greater role in public life. To which one might say, and the problem is? Now, you can disagree with this stuff, and I think that probably what Liptak says is correct. I think that the Supreme Court, with Kavanaugh on it and with Roberts in the center, is going to give states more power. I think we can expect, it's quite correct, some modifications in the Supreme Court's abortion jurisprudence. They're not going to overrule Roe versus Wade, not while John Roberts is Chief Justice. But it may well be that states' ability to protect fetal life is going to be enhanced in the later weeks of abortion. I do think that the Supreme Court, and John Roberts has been very prominent in this, is quite likely to suggest that counting by race violates the Constitution, and that indeed affirmative action based on race in colleges is constitutionally suspect. I'm not sure that's a bad thing. I'm not sure that Martin Luther King's notion that we ought to be judged by the content of our character and not our race isn't a good idea. Upholding voting restrictions may or may not be problematic. There is voter fraud out there, and the states, by the Constitution, are given the right to control the franchise. The Supreme Court may move in that direction. I don't have much knowledge about expanding gun rights, but I do know that the Supreme Court has been clear in the Heller case that it's an individual right, and you would expect the Supreme Court to continue in that direction. I personally think that if the Supreme Court strikes down campaign finance regulations, it'll be doing the right thing. And the reason for that is most of these provisions in their effects are basically incumbent protection legislation. You have to go out, you have to hire lawyers, you have to spend a lot of money, you have to get consultants. It's very difficult to overturn or it's very difficult to unseat a sitting congressman. And it may well be that striking down some campaign finance regulations is not a bad thing. Now, the last one may give some of you some pause. Giving religion a greater role in public life. I think that one's right, too. And I'm going to say a little bit more about that in a little while. Let me pass on from that for the time being, though. What really is going on here? I'm sure you figured it out. Where does the vitriol come from in Kavanaugh's critics? Why are people so upset about Kavanaugh? Well, I think what's happening is there are now two pretty well-established traditions in jurisprudence. The legal academy is devoted to the notion of the Constitution as a living and breathing document. Okay? Conservatives, however, embrace the notion of original understanding or originalism. The greatest advocates of both these views you're both familiar with. Let's put them up on the board. That's Chief Justice Earl Warren of the United States Supreme Court, the moving force behind Brown versus Board of Education, and his court did lots of other things that you're familiar with, like the Miranda case, and like Baker versus Carr, and like Reynolds versus Sims. For Chief Justice Warren, the job of the Supreme Court was to rethink, in some ways, the meaning of terms like equal protection, and to make them accord with, in Earl Warren's words, what was then perceived to be fair, the evolving standards of society. Holding the other view is that recently deceased man, Justice Scalia. He said, and some of you are familiar with this because I've used this term before, that the Constitution is not a living document. It's dead, dead, dead. Hard to sell that as a slogan. But it makes a certain amount of sense. It has a fixed meaning. You want to change it, you amend it. You don't want, to use the term again, 9 unelected E4s deciding for themselves what the law ought to be like. But as I say, there's a long tradition, certainly since Earl Warren, maybe even before, of the court having a fair amount of freedom, and this is certainly picked up by Chemerinsky, to modify what's out there. But the idea of originalism has been gaining steam lately. Okay? Let's take a look at a few originalists. There's Clarence Thomas, probably the single most devoted originalist on the court. And there's Neil Gorsuch from around here, who also describes himself as an originalist. And the opposition to Brett Kavanaugh is that he's an extraordinary originalist as well. And so are a lot of other smart people. I think it makes sense. I think it fastens down the court. But let's move on, okay? As I say, there certainly are dangers to the republic. What are they? Okay, let me have a little bit of fun, give me a little bit of license. That's Samuel Chase. Samuel Chase is the only United States Supreme Court justice ever to be impeached. The Jeffersonians didn't like him at all. He was not a friend to them, and he very strictly enforced the Alien and Sedition Acts. But I want to talk about one thing that he said in 1800 to a jury. He told that jury, there are only 2 ways to ruin a republic: the introduction of luxury and the licentiousness of the press. Remarkably, he said that in 1800. Okay? So he was drawing from English experience, the licentiousness of the press, not a concept that you hear too much about these days. It's a very interesting question whether that's what we've got, the licentiousness of the press. That anonymous op-ed, for example, in the New York Times a few days ago seems to be something new and different, and something that, since it's unsigned, it's very difficult to assign responsibility for. President Trump's notion of fake news fits in here, and I'll say a bit more about that in a little while. But there is also, and there has been in this country for a long, long time, the journalistic notion that if it bleeds, it leads. Is that really what the First Amendment was supposed to be all about? Or is there something else? Should we have a somewhat more objective take on the news? I want to give you one pundit's take on this, a man named Michael Walsh, and there he is. He's a very interesting cultural critic. He's a former music critic for Time magazine, but for my money, he's one of the smartest pundits around. He wrote a marvelous book called The Devil's Pleasure Palace. It's all about, he calls it, the cult of critical theory and the subversion of the West. It's all about the influence of the Frankfurt School on American intellectuals. It's pretty deep, but he's got a lot of very interesting current thoughts. He writes for a website that I write for sometimes called American Greatness, and you can catch his work there. He says, you don't have to agree, consumed with resentment toward a man they loathe, and worse, for whom not a single person they collectively know voted, today's journalists jealously guard what's left of their dignity, their ethics, and their honor, even as they gnaw at their own entrails and wonder why they're dying. I wish I could write like that. But I think his point is, maybe journalists don't have a sense that maybe there's a responsibility that's not being fulfilled, okay? As I say, you don't have to take this view seriously, but I think there's something going on out there. Well, what about this concept of fake news? What about the notion that there's a chaotic White House? Just this week, as you know, this book by Bob Woodward was released, Fear. And Bob Woodward's point is there's chaos in the White House. Yeah, well, there was chaos when Winston Churchill was in charge as well. There was the constant charge being made that there was the similar kind of chaos in Ronald Reagan's White House. I couldn't resist that. I like that. Very interesting. I mean, the man was, after all, a co-star with a chimpanzee, but he was, I think, a significant president, and the kind of creative disorder that you see in this White House, you see in that one as well. Well, what is it? What is it really that promotes that chaos? What's going on? Well, I think one of the reasons for the perception is the special counsel. There's Bob Mueller. Now, I'm one of the very many people who thought this guy is a real straight arrow. People on the right and left really thought you couldn't get any more honest than a former FBI director and a former, I think, US attorney and all the other things. He also worked for a law firm that I did for a while, which made him beyond reproach. I'm not certain anymore. Neither is apparently Ken Starr. And there, in fact, is Ken Starr, who's just written a book. What about this institution of the special counsel? We Americans like to come up with all-purpose solutions for things. The special counsel is one. But the problem with the special counsel, or a problem, as you know, is once you're the special counsel, you feel a duty to find something, to prosecute somebody. You become a lot like Inspector Javert from Les Miserables. You want to convict somebody. It's a bit of a troubled institution, I think, and there's more, okay? The more is, what exactly is it that's being investigated, okay? The original suggestion was Donald Trump is controlled by Vladimir Putin. That was the suggestion. And there are people, prominent people, who believe that, okay? For example, the former head of the CIA, John Brennan, and the former head of the DIA, James Clapper. Both of them seem to see, or at least say they see, some substance in this Russia collusion charge. Now, I'm not completely sure about that. And we seem to be, and again, this is a little contentious. You don't have to accept it. But we seem to be seeing, as we learn more and more, that the source of the collusion charge comes from this fellow, Michael Steele, a somewhat discredited British intelligence operative who, in connection with Fusion GPS, a rather intriguing outfit, and in something now we know financed by the DNC and the Clinton campaign to the tune of just about $12 million, produced a dossier which was then passed on to the FBI, people like Peter Strzok and his associate Lisa Page, and also Bruce Orr, the fourth-ranking person in the Justice Department, who's married to Nellie Orr, who worked at Fusion GPS. Now, we haven't got the details yet. We're still waiting. But it does look like there's more than an even chance that this collusion narrative is one of the greatest political dirty tricks we've ever seen. We'll know, I think. We don't know yet, but we should know soon. Now, if that's the case, I think it gives you further reason to really wonder. And there are lots of people out there, just to rattle off a few names. Conrad Black, Victor Davis Hanson, Fox News, Breitbart, Rush Limbaugh, The Washington Times seem very much convinced that this is what happened. Now, as I say, we still have a little bit to learn. We're not 100% sure, but here's something to contemplate. In Bob Woodward's book, he quotes, without disputing it, the President's counsel, John Dowd, who says of Mueller's investigation, the entire inquiry appears to be the product of a conspiracy by the DNC, Fusion GPS, which did the Steele dossier, and senior FBI intelligence officials to undermine the Trump presidency. So here in this anti-Trump book, a perfect opportunity to say there's substance there. Woodward is unable to do it. Now that, to me, is a very interesting piece of data. But more to the point that I want to make. I said there were dangers to the Republic in this. I'm not the only one concerned about that. That's Steve Calabrese. Steve Calabrese, my colleague, my former colleague at Northwestern, is one of the founders of the Federalist Society. And he's very much, Steve is, a constitutionalist, originalist, orthodox scholar. And he says of the special prosecutor that it's unconstitutional. He says that because it is, after all, a senior government official, and that kind of a senior government official, says Calabrese, really ought to be, he's a principal officer, he ought to be appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. Calabrese says, since that wasn't done here, it was simply an appointment made by an inferior official in the Justice Department, not the president. That means, says Calabrese, he wrote this in a New York Times op-ed piece, I think, that means that every single thing that Mueller has done ought to be nullified by the courts. Now, good luck with that. I don't think it's likely to happen, but it raises an interesting problem. Here's somebody else who had a difficulty with the special counsel. In a very interesting opinion of the Supreme Court called Morrison versus Olson a few years back, the Supreme Court voted with one dissent, with Scalia dissenting, that Ken Starr's kind of special counsel was constitutional. No, it's not, said Scalia, and time has tended to suggest that Scalia was right. Why? Well, because the special counsel isn't really subject to supervision by the president. And it is a little bit of a betrayal of the Constitution's plan of separation of powers, in which you have the executive branch that does things like prosecution, led by a single executive. His point is a little bit like Calabrese's. So what I'm trying to suggest is there are, I think, sophisticated people out there wondering about the constitutionality of this particular institution. Well, suppose it was unconstitutional. Does that mean we should worry about presidential power being untrammeled? Do you need a special prosecutor to rein it in? I don't think so. And it doesn't take very much thought to see really some of the checks on presidential power. Now, one of the most obvious checks on presidential power is the inertia of what you could call the administrative state, the bureaucracy, the agencies, if you like, the deep state. If you've got time, carefully look at that cartoon. It's terrific. The steady state, as the anonymous author called it, or the swamp. Here's Michael Walsh on that. Let's see if I can find this for you. The dirty little secret of official Washington is that every single civil servant and Washington bureau reporter has more job security than the president. Voter and term-limited chief executives may come and go, but Congress, the agencies, and the parasites who feed off of them are nearly forever, long after the current occupant of the White House is gone. I think there's some truth to that, okay? The point here is the president doesn't act alone. The agencies have to implement what he does, and they can serve as a check on him. The 25th Amendment, recently called for by a few Democrats, is another check. If the president really is incapacitated, there's a constitutional vehicle to take him out. And, of course, there's the constitutional scheme of separation of powers itself. A president can't pass laws. They try. And they can do executive orders, and they can have the force of law until another president comes along and overturns them. But really, it's the Congress that ought to be passing the laws. Okay? Judicial review is also out there to check the president, and even President Trump has found himself stymied in his immigration policies and some other things by the courts. That's a check on presidential power. So is the congressional veto. Okay? He can veto acts by Congress. That's powerful. That's a check. But they can override him if they get enough votes to do it. And it's been done. Even Bill Clinton found himself overridden by, found his veto overridden by Congress at least once. And then we come to the other thing that I want to say a couple of words about. Impeachment. 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 Okay, there is the most famous recently impeached president. And I had a little bit to do with that. I went down, I was one of 19 scholars, I've said this on this podium before, asked to tell the Congress what an impeachable offense was. And I was riding high in those days. I actually peaked, I think, back in 1998. I got to be on Good Morning America. I got to be on the Geraldo show 4 times. Doesn't get any better than that. And it got considerably worse. But that's another story. What about impeachment? The Constitution gives it a narrow definition: treason, bribery, and other high crimes and misdemeanors. Now that means that it ought to be pretty serious. There was a lot of question about whether what President Clinton did mounted to that seriousness. But the difficulty here is the framers worried it could be abused. The framers thought that it could be used to undermine the executive. The framers didn't want an all-powerful legislature, and they were worried that the legislature could remove a president at will. Now, I think it's pretty clear that if the Democrats do take the House, we're going to see impeachment proceedings. And I don't think it's going to be very pretty. The difficulty here, and you know all about it, is these words mean anything a majority of the House thinks they mean. Gerald Ford used that as the definition, and he was absolutely right. There's no judicial review of an impeachment. Now remember, an impeachment is just the bringing of charges by the House. The Senate has to vote, and a Republican Senate is not going to come up with a 2/3 vote to take out a successful Republican president. I don't think, but you never know. We didn't think there was much of a chance that Nixon was going to be impeached and removed, but he resigned rather than face that possibility. So it's also possible that the presidency could be severely undermined and crippled if impeachment becomes something regular that you do whenever the other side's party has the presidency. Maybe it's not a bad thing to cripple the presidency, but I think it is. I think you need a strong executive, just as I think you need a strong Congress and a strong court, but all institutions doing what they're supposed to do. Now, there is a powerful argument to be made that undermining the constitutional scheme of presidential elections and separation of powers by too easily removing the president is a very bad thing. That's what Cass Sunstein said in the Clinton impeachment era. He's been unfortunately rather silent lately on that point. Sad business. All right, let's move on. What then should a sensible republic be doing? I want to shift gears here. And again, I want to go into maybe somewhat provocative territory. What should a sensible republic be doing? Where do you look if you want to find that out? What is it that's the essence of conservative thought and policy? Well, I think the essence is the work of this man, Russell Kirk. One of my predecessors, Bradley Berger, wrote a book on Russell Kirk. Russell Kirk would be 100 years old next month if he were still alive, but he passed away, I think, about 20 years ago or so. Now, what is it? Where do you look, and what did he have to say? Well, you look at this book, and I strongly recommend anybody on the left or right get a copy of it, because it is the best guide to what conservatives think and the historical development of conservative thought. I'm going to lay out for you some things that Russell Kirk believed that I think are the core principles, really, of a conservative. Now, there's a little bit of a difficulty in that conservatives aren't supposed to go for abstract theory. So to boil things down to abstract principles the way I'm about to do is not supposed to necessarily be the right thing to do. But this is what Kirk believed, and I think he had a point. All right, what are his canons of conservative thought? One, a belief that a divine intent rules society as well as individual conscience. That's bold. Affection for the proliferating variety and mystery of traditional life, as distinguished from the narrowing uniformity and egalitarianism and utilitarian aims of most radical systems. Think Jeremy Bentham, and you'll understand why it's a great idea to reject that sort of thing. Conviction that civilized society requires orders and classes, which means, by the way, that some inequality is probably appropriate. A persuasion that property and freedom are inseparably connected and that economic leveling is not necessarily economic progress. A distrust, I like this, of sophisters and calculators. You remember Edmund Burke's term, beware of oikonomous sophisters and calculators. People who think they have theories that'll govern everything. Finally, a recognition that change and reform are not identical and that innovation can be a devouring conflagration, and it is more often than it is a torch of progress, okay? That's what I think real conservatives believe. Now, if you want further development of this, tune in next month when Gerald Rasulo, an expert on Russell Kirk, lectures, probably not from this podium, but from one much like it here. I'm bringing him in as one of my guests. All right, those then might well be interesting principles. Here's a controversial assertion. That's exactly what this administration is trying to do. Now, it doesn't articulate it as well as it ought to, but I think that's what the administration is up to. In the process of rolling back ill-conceived regulation, reducing taxes to reinforce private investment and private property, through the creation of more jobs and a booming economy, and appointing justices and judges committed to the rule of law and the original understanding, which will give us a little bit better protection, I think, of property. I also believe, a little bit more controversially, that this administration, and Trump has said as much in his speeches, you may or may not choose to believe him, but at least he thinks it's necessary to say it. He's reflecting a belief on the part of the framers that there can be no order without law, no law without morality, and no morality without religion. As I say, highly controversial, but traditional in some ways. Further, I think there's an understanding that the lower and middle classes must be preserved. And I think that fits a little bit with Russell Kirk's ideas about hierarchies and diversity, the way that he sees it, a proliferation of diversity. I've called this, by the way, sometimes in columns on Newsmax and in American Greatness, the Trumpian counter-reformation. I think that's brilliant. But there may be even better ways to talk about it. Here's one who talks about it in slightly different language. That's F.H. Buckley. And he's coming in to talk in this program, too. He'll be here next week. And he wrote a very, very interesting book called The Republican Workers' Party, just published this week. He's a coming attraction. I urge you to come and see him talk. All right, and I would be remiss, even though Bob already was kind enough to mention them. If you want to pursue this further, there are two more spectacularly good books to recommend to you. One is Recapturing the Constitution, and the other is Law Professors, 3 Centuries of Shaping American Law. They lay out, these books do, the theory of originalism and indeed why it might be the most sensible jurisprudence, and quite a bit more. All right, be that as it may, that's some of the reading that you can do. Let's begin to come to something of a conclusion. What then is the future for Donald Trump? Well, there's one possibility. Now, that's not a sure thing by any means. If Trump is impeached and/or removed, he may well be a footnote to history. But if he's successful, then I think he may go down as certainly one of our most exciting presidents. Here's a comment, an interesting comment from Daniel Henninger from the Wall Street Journal a day or two ago. He says, there are 2 Trumps. There is Donald Trump, the person, to whom one can attach 20 adjectives and nouns along a scale from obnoxious idiot to unappreciated genius. This is the Trump of Twitter. The second Trump is the Trump presidency, which consists of hundreds of individuals appointed to execute his policies. With the help of a Republican Congress, his policies also included the reversal of the Obama era's multitudinous economic regulations, and in December, a 40% reduction in the corporate tax rate to 21% from 35%. In the 6 months between December and everyone's summer vacation, the US economy achieved full employment. We now have a labor shortage. Unemployment rates for blacks and Hispanics, as you know, are at historic lows. After 8 years of suppression, a still powerful US economy has been liberated. Well, maybe. And yet, there's still a yearning in some quarters to do away with capitalism and replace it with socialism. The idea lingers. And indeed, I think there may be something that's built into our DNA about that. There's the old saw. Various people have had it attributed to them. Oscar Wilde, George Bernard Shaw, Clemenceau. And that is basically anyone who's not a socialist at 20 has no heart. And anybody who remains a socialist at 30 has no head. You've heard that before. But there's something attractive about that. And time will tell whether the Trumpian ideals or the socialist ideals are going to prevail in this country. All right, I'm going to leave the lecture part. I'll finish the lecture part in just a couple of minutes. I want to give you another couple of interesting quotes. Here's one from a man named Thomas Fleming. Thomas Fleming is the longtime editor of Chronicles, which, by the way, is a paleoconservative journal. Not terribly well known. But if you start looking at things like that, and you read Russell Kirk, you'll get a notion of what paleoconservatism is, and it's not anything like neoconservatism. What does Fleming have to say? He says, with regard to Trump, well, here we are again. There is a flawed, paranoid president in the White House, making mistakes every day and inventing policies on the fly. But a president who is actually making things work again. From the perspective of the permanent government, Trump's dynamism and improvisation are turning Washington into crazy town, by which they mean that this maniac is determined when he departs to leave the country in a better shape than it was when he came into office. Even to imagine this, even to imagine that this could be possible, his critics think, is a sign of megalomaniac insanity. Well, that's the view of the critics. What else might possibly be going on in our era at this time? I want to quote one more person. That's Thomas Hutchinson, the last royal governor of Massachusetts. And he said, trying to figure out what was going on amid the Stamp Act crisis and the early pre-revolutionary stirrings, he said, the generality of the people who are in easy circumstances will not risk their property and security for the benefit of a few irresponsible agitators. The present frenzy will pass, he says, for you are Englishmen. No people upon the globe have been oftener in a frenzy, and none return sooner to their senses than Englishmen. Substitute Americans for Englishmen, and you have our situation. Thank you.
Do you want me to do it?
I can do it.
Okay. So there'll be time for questions, of course. There's not, let me mention, there's not a reception. We almost always have receptions, but it didn't work out tonight, so come to another event and I'll certainly go issue food. Sorry.
All right, one of the most fun parts is usually questions. We've got about 10 minutes. Yes, sir.
Given the recognizing the fact that you haven't talked at all about the societal disruption that we're experiencing, but let me ask, Kavanaugh said that the Ford versus the Brown of Education ruling was, I think he said it was the most glorious ruling in Supreme Court history. Was that a political statement or coming from an originalist? Did he believe that?
That's a terrific question. It's a wonderful, wonderful question. Now, let me tell you, yeah, the question was, in the Kavanaugh hearings, Brett Kavanaugh said, I forget what the exact words were, but the essential idea was that Brown versus Board of Education was the greatest decision ever rendered by the U.S. Supreme Court. And the question was that really consistent with originalism, or was that merely a political ploy? There are two different views to that. Now, I'll tell you my thoughts. I think it was a political ploy. But you could argue that the original meaning of the 14th Amendment was to get rid of all racial distinctions. And you could argue that Brown, insofar as it said we can't have segregated schools, was consistent with that original understanding. That's what Robert Bork had to say. Now, that also seems to be the view of nearly everybody in the Academy, that Brown is the greatest decision ever rendered. It is, however, probably incorrect. And it's incorrect because what Brown did was take the power of regulating the school systems away from the states. And I think that went against the accepted constitutional scheme, at least at the time of the 14th Amendment. As I'm sure you know, Raoul Berger, the guy who gave my chair to Northwestern Law School and named it after himself, wrote a book on that precise point, Government by Judiciary. And I think he proves pretty well that Brown is inconsistent with the original understanding.
But it's a reflective of the evolution and the strength of the federal government.
I think it is.
And so you're saying Kavanaugh really doesn't believe that? But
no, I think he may well believe it. because I think virtually everybody in the academy does. The position that I take on that, and Berger's take on that, is very much a minority position. I don't think he was lying when he said that.
Did society benefit from it or not?
I don't know. It's a tough one. It's a really tough one. And the reason it's a tough one is after Brown, the inner city schools fell apart. When all the whites moved out to the suburbs, leaving too many poor kids in the inner city school systems. I think a better move, and some of the interesting progressives have suggested the same thing. There's a man named Mark Tushnet who has come here to speak from time to time, who's a professor at Harvard and a clerk for Thurgood Marshall. And he says it would have been much, much better, instead of desegregating the schools, to require the states to expend equal amounts per pupil. At some point, that probably would have meant unitary school systems, but it might not have ruined, at least that's Tushnet's theory, the inner city schools.
School systems like the DC public school systems in America, but enough of that.
You might. I mean, it's just a thought. Great question. More. Yep.
Okay, you talked a little bit about Russell Kirk.
Yeah.
And his beliefs on tradition and the necessity of religion and morality. Yeah. Would you say that Russell Kirk, well, I guess the question is, would Russell Kirk accept what many of our founding fathers did, which is freedom of conscience, the ability to choose, to decide your morality for yourself, and believe those things, and then act accordingly?
That's a wonderful question. He certainly was a believer in individual responsibility, and certainly a believer that individuals were capable of moral decisions. But I'm not sure that he would have said the kind of things that Kennedy said, for example, in Planned Parenthood versus Casey, in which he suggested that everybody's entitled for themselves to come up with the meaning of the universe and human life. He'd say, I think Kirk would say, no, the culture helps you figure that out. So I'm not sure that he'd say you can figure it out for yourself. And especially somebody like you who's sensitive to these quasi-theological issues in government might have some trouble with that. And I think you might have some trouble with Russell Kirk. Quick question. You haven't read The Conservative Mind, have you? Oh, you have?
I read the whole thing.
Oh, wow. Read it again. Very, very good. More. Yeah.
When you were talking about the Supreme Court, you mentioned that campaign finance, like deregulation, may not necessarily be a bad thing. What is the kind of...
No. Throwing out campaign finance regulation may not be a bad thing.
So making it more strict than it is? Is that...
No, doing away with it. It strikes me that there's no silver bullet to eliminate money in politics.
Right.
Every time it's tried, people come up with ways to get around it. I am most comfortable, I think, with the critics of McCain-Feingold and giving up that attempt. Now, again, that's not exactly an orthodox, widely held position. But I do think that it's fundamentally wrong if you can't run for office without hiring a battery of lawyers and consultants to keep you out of committing a felony.
So the issue is more about the regulations themselves, not the money that is going in and out. Just the fact that it's so hard to comply with.
I think so. I think so. Yes, sir.
I wonder if you have a comment or two about your thoughts on why the anti-Trump hysteria is what it is relative to the other presidents. Reagan, Bush, they all had their haters, but Trump...
no, it does seem to be at a new level, doesn't it?
It's a new level of
I think,
something.
I mean, I treat this with treat everything I say with a grain of salt. Treat this one with a minute grain of salt. We are at a cultural inflection point. The left thought it had won the culture war. Now it turns out it didn't. And that's really enraging. Now, there's also, I mean, just with Kavanaugh, if Trump is successful in getting Kavanaugh through, and if he gets one or two more, like Amy Coney Barrett or whatever her name is, the Supreme Court will change for 1 or 2 generations. And, you know, that's a fighting concept. So I think what's happening is that we are moving in a different direction much faster. And that's what is giving us that feeling. Yeah?
Do you think that we're moving forward, or do you think that we're moving backwards to a time when rich white guys ruled?
Well, that's the risk. There are enough laws on the books. There's enough anti-discrimination legislation. There's enough practice. Let's take Kavanaugh, for example. Most of his clerks turn out to be women, and about 1/4 of them are minorities. There is deeply ingrained in the culture a very egalitarian outlook that wasn't there a generation ago. I don't think that's going to be turned back.
Because it certainly feels like it's headed in that direction, because every change that seems to be being made is a change in favor of white, Christian, rich culture. You just mentioned that the left lost the culture war,
yeah.
But the culture war is a result of the changing face of American society, and how can you revert to a place where it's how it was? The originalism of the Constitution never took the kind of diversity into account that we're dealing with today. Don't you have to change government to account for that?
Well, perhaps you do, but that's what the constitutional amendment process is for. And indeed, some of the changes, like doing away with slavery and giving women the right to vote, are accomplished through constitutional change. It's just, do you want the courts doing it, or would you rather the American people themselves did it? And would you rather change came from legislatures or from justices who are being given by legislatures the power to change things that the people's representatives really should be changing? Yeah. I don't think it's necessarily a step back. It's just reordering the institutions in a way to make them more consistent with the original constitutional scheme.
Okay, well, just last quick follow-up. Would you say that in today's Senate, that those senators represent the people, or do you think that those senators represent a very small subsection of the people and they are catering to those people with their decisions?
Well, the U.S. Senate is a great thing to ask about. I think the U.S. Senate today is not the way it's supposed to be. And I forget, what are we talking about, the 17th Amendment? The greatest mistake in the world was the 17th Amendment. Direct election of senators turns them into the same body as the House of Representatives, and I think it's a huge mistake. So I think the answer to your question is yes.
That they do represent the people?
That I don't think they do an adequate job of doing
okay.
that. And I don't think their institution should be doing it. I think they should be representing the state legislatures. Yes, sir.
I'm curious what you saw in President Trump early on, because everything I see that you wrote early on was in support of him. I saw him here when he did the second debate. He was my 16th choice out of 14.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah. And you, as I go back and read your writings, a few other folks.
Yeah.
Got it right.
We like to say there was a handful of us in the academy who supported me. There were exactly 5 out of about 1,800 or whatever it is. And what I saw in him was that he said in a very early speech, I will take my justices from the recommendations of the Federalist Society and the Heritage Foundation. That was enough to get me. The rest of it was gravy. More. Yeah.
So I've got a question about originalism. So your articulation of fake news, I wasn't quite convinced about it. It was kind of like intimating, shoddy reporting. But think back to the founding era and the press during the founding era. The Federalist papers were anonymously penned.
Yeah.
And each city had 6 or 7 partisan papers that were for-profit papers, and they were vicious.
Absolutely.
Samuel Chase is also talking about the viciousness that happens in the press.
Yeah, he's referring to contemporary newspapers, just as you suggest.
It's always a danger to think analogously and anachronistically. But might we see some insights in the founding era press, which was very detached. I mean, detached in the sense there wasn't one common newspaper that everyone read.
Yeah.
People were reading select pieces that fit their views, and it actually made for more robust.
No, I think that's a powerful point, and I agree. Sometimes it's said, or it used to be said 30 years ago that we had a two-party system and a one-party press. We don't have that anymore. And the reason for that probably is the internet, Fox News, and other developments. No, I couldn't be more in agreement with you on that point. I do think we need lots of different voices. That's what the First Amendment is supposed to be doing. Yes, ma'am.
I came here hoping to understand why the conservative side is so far away from my beliefs. And when you listed the things that would change under Kavanaugh, states getting more power, and I think about, well, if Brown versus Board of Education hadn't been decided that way and states were allowed to segregate, would that be for the betterment of society? Abortion restrictions, you talked about protecting fetal life, but not about protecting women's health care or autonomy. Voting restrictions, you mentioned voter fraud, but not restrictions put in place that make it more difficult for people to vote. Expanding gun rights versus the right to live without fear that somebody here could shoot me right now. And then the greater role of religion, but I'm a person who on a number of these things, including religion, I tend to come out on the wrong end. For example, if CU decided not to give birth control to women because of, if it wasn't state school, or a wedding cake that somebody might decide they can't bake for me. I mean, so what I'm left with is, and then a lot of people cheered what you said, and you said these are good things, so I'm left with, we really are very far apart. So is it going to be a cultural war that we have to fight?
I hope not. And every single position that you articulated has a basis. And it's hard to convince you if what we're talking about is basic values that flow from basic moral choices that you've made. What's disturbing, I think, are some of the folks out there who say there's no such thing as morality. Let's not even worry about that. And there's some strains of some modern jurisprudence that goes in that direction. Now, with regard to each one of these policies that we could debate, the real question, I think, is, given that the Constitution doesn't really address them, with exception maybe the Second Amendment, which there's an express provision regarding, shouldn't that be decided by the political branches and not the judiciary? And maybe we could agree on that. And maybe we could agree that it's a choice for the people to make, because this is supposed to be a republic based on popular sovereignty. But I think in my long life, I don't believe I've ever convinced anybody of anything. So I wouldn't have expected to turn you around tonight. But at least if I've helped you to think a little bit.
More to understand the other side. And again, I'm left with, we really just are so far apart.
Yeah, there is a division.
The political process will work if there are voting restrictions, or if we don't have campaign finance reform, because then I don't think everybody has a voice.
Well, I don't think anybody wants to cut off anybody's voices. And I think there's plenty of legislation to make sure that doesn't happen. But I mean, I don't dispute any of those points that you make that we'll take. Yep.
Professor, first let me say it's good to see you again. I was a student in your corporations class 23 years ago. Also, to expand on the question that was just asked, it seems to me that sort of the broad contours of your critique of government by judiciary are that the courts shouldn't be deciding many of these questions, legislatures should be deciding them.
Right.
But then on your specific list of 6, it seemed to me they actually divided 3 and 3 on what you were calling for, right? So you were saying legislatures and states should get to have more control over abortion, voting restrictions, and religious expression. But then you were also saying, but only the courts should control race-conscious decisions, gun rights, and campaign finance, right? You're saying that the legislatures and the states shouldn't be left to control those 3 things. Courts should strike down state laws that would allow race-conscious decisions, state laws that would restrict gun rights, or state laws that would regulate campaign finance.
Yeah, that's not me. Yeah. That's the U.S. Constitution.
Well, maybe. I'll just say maybe. I mean, I think that is probably the part where there's interpretations of the U.S. Constitution.
Yeah, somebody taught you argument very well indeed.
No, I wanted to speak to that a little bit more about how much do you really believe that it seems that the things that you're assigning to the courts to decide are things that popular majorities would not agree with the Republican Party platform on, and the things that you're assigning for state legislatures to decide are things where popular majorities in some states might agree with the Republican Party platform, and that seems like the rule of decision there, and so I'd like to address that.
Yeah, I hope that's wrong. I hope that, and this is a criticism, by the way, not uncommon of originalists. All you're trying to do is implement the Republican Party platform. I hope that's incorrect. I hope that there's a grounding in solid historical basis for the positions that I'm taking. And I guess that's all I can say about that. But it's a fair point. The right shouldn't simply be devoted to the outcomes they favor. There should be some kind of coherent constitutional theory based in the original understanding of the document. So you're right about that. Anybody who hasn't spoken yet? Yes, sir.
Out there. Could you speak to, if we do get the Supreme Court to be, let's say, 6-3 conservative majority, what are the long-term effects on the legal academy?
That's a great question. I don't know if there are going to be long-term effects on the legal academy if the court becomes more conservative. Unless and I'm being a little silly here, unless the academy, unless the law teachers decide, all right, we have to rethink things so we can get our students clerking on the Supreme Court. I don't know. I think what's interesting is the jurisprudential theory tends to come out of the academy and show up in the court about a generation later. I think it's a great question. I haven't thought about it, and I don't have an easy answer. Now, the academy is practical, and if thinking about law changes in a lot of different places, maybe it'll change. But one of the things that I've discovered teaching in law schools is what's going on out there in the real world in practice is not necessarily determinative of thought inside the academy. So the answer to your question is, gosh, I don't know. Yes, sir.
I really appreciate you coming all the way out here to Colorado to give us a chance to really discuss some of these issues from both sides. For instance, I hear some people say that conservatives believe this or that on abortion or on voter rights. That's not necessarily so. And so we really need a platform here where we can articulate our sides of the issues and discuss them openly without being shouted down. And I appreciate you coming.
You're very kind. Thank you.
So my question, I've been thinking a lot about what the role of the federal government is or should be. Because in my opinion, the purpose of the federal government is to equalize is to homogenize and equalize the situation across the country so that we don't end up with a third of the country that still has slavery and a third of the country that thinks the complete opposite and then part of the country over here that's doing whatever they want. So I'm curious what your vision of what the federal government is for is.
It's a bit different from yours, I'm afraid. The federal government, I think, is to preserve two things. At least if you take the basic principles of the Constitution. One is the separation of powers so that courts don't legislate and the other branches don't trench on the particular powers of each other. But the second point, and this is where I think you and I would differ, is to preserve the system of dual sovereignty. That the federal government, the 10th Amendment says, is supposed to be one of limited and enumerated powers. And in Jefferson's time, at least, there was a belief that governments closest to the people were the ones, the state and local governments, that deserved to be trusted with the most discretion over the most areas of law. Now, that's not a very popular position in a lot of quarters these days, but that's what I think the Constitution was designed to do.
Let's stop it right there and thank Mr. President. Thanks for coming. Hope to see you again soon.